Hi, I'm Mimi Gerges. Worldwide, over 100 million Christians endure persecution every year. A new documentary looks at how Christians around the world respond to that persecution.
They ask you to deny your faith. I refuse.
Welcome to the Mimi Gerges Show. Christian communities in many parts of the world are facing persecutions, ranging from political and social harassment all the way to death and near extinction. A team of 15 of the world's leading scholars of global Christianity were commissioned to investigate this question: how do Christian communities around the world respond to persecution? The project, called Under Caesar's Sword, also produced a documentary with the same name. Timothy Shaw is one of the study leaders and a director at the Religious Freedom Institute. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Mimi. Great to be with you.
You say in the film that there's a, quote, massive humanitarian catastrophe. How bad are things for Christians worldwide?
Things are very bad. Just to give you a sense of the proportions, we may be talking about as many as 500 million Christians who live in parts of the world where they're subject to serious forms of persecution. That's something like 20–25% of the world's Christian community. To put another perspective on it, Christians probably constitute the majority of the world's victims of religious persecution, which is a growing problem in our world. So however you look at it, this is a huge, huge problem.
Have things gotten worse recently, or are we just paying more attention to it?
I think it's fair to say things have gotten worse more recently. It's true there's also more attention, but just to take one example, the rise of Islamist violence and extremism in the Middle East and North Africa has seen a major increase in the last 20–30 years in countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and many of the victims of that form of extremism have been Christians.
You know, put another way, the Pew Research says that 76% of the world's population lives in a country where religious freedom is severely curtailed.
Yes.
When you think about it that way, that's 3 out of 4 people.
That's right. A huge proportion of the world's people live in countries where they're facing some kind of persecution, either from the government or from non-state actors, like ISIL. There are other non-state groups all over the world, Al-Shabaab, which operates in East Africa. That group inflicts persecution, often targets people for religious reasons. So whether it's from the state or from non-state actors, huge numbers of people face this kind of persecution.
On the other side, Tim, I think it's hard for Americans to see Christianity, which is the world's largest religion, as this minority that's
Yes.
under attack.
You know, the global media, much of the way we think about the world really is produced by people who live in places like Washington, D.C. here. And of course, in Western countries like America, we don't see Christians facing serious persecution. So it's hard to relate to the idea that Christians can be beleaguered minorities. But in fact, there are 2–2.5 billion Christians, and many, many Christians do live as minorities in many parts of the world, and many of them do face very severe forms of discrimination and persecution.
So let's talk about India. It's a stable, peaceful democracy. It's a secular country, yet there's violence against Christians there.
That's right.
What's happening?
Yes, I mean, one has to kind of keep things in perspective. As you say, India has a lot going for it. It is an officially secular democracy. It has had almost uninterrupted democratic rule with parliamentary elections since independence in 1947. There was a brief period in the mid-70s where democracy was suspended, not really because of religious reasons. So India has a robust democracy. India has a constitution that protects religious freedom. And remember, this is an enormous country. In a couple of years, it will be the most populous country in the world, 1.2–1.3 billion people. It will soon surpass China, with a huge diversity of religious communities who, by and large, live together peacefully. By and large, there are high levels of religious tolerance. And Hinduism has bequeathed to India a culture and tradition of tolerance, of pluralism, of interreligious harmony, by and large. That's the positive side. But the negative side is that in recent years, probably since the 1960s, 1970s, there have been rising, mostly informal, mostly non-lethal, but still serious attacks on Christian individuals and Christian institutions. And this is probably primarily because of changes in India's political dynamics since the 1970s.
It didn't happen overnight. I
It
mean,
didn't happen
things
overnight.
have been brewing, it seems.
That's right. Some of the roots of these attacks go back to the 19th century. We saw in the beginning of the 19th century an increase in the number of Dalits or untouchables converting to Christianity. Many of these were spontaneous movements where many untouchables felt that in order for them to have a sense of dignity and a sense of freedom, to be able to hold their head up, they were drawn to Christianity and the message, the liberating message of the gospel. Now, this dynamic created a sense of threat on the part of the Hindu establishment. Many Hindu groups were very, very worried about this, and so conversion began to get a kind of bad name. And the fact that some Western missionaries were sometimes involved in these conversionary movements really began to worry some Hindus who concluded, well, these people are trying to undermine Hindu culture. So there is widespread in India a suspicion of Christians as engaging in predatory missionary activity that is designed to undermine Hindu...
Even though Christianity has been in India since
Yes.
the early centuries
That's right.
of Christianity.
That's right. Christianity has been present from at least the 3rd century.
There was some very tragic riots in 2008 in Kandhamal.
Yes, that's right.
This is in eastern India.
Yes.
What happened there?
Well, this was a really horrific series of incidents over the course of several months in which something like 100 or more Christians were killed, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of Christians were displaced. The origins of what happened are a bit complicated. A Hindu leader who had been preaching against Christian conversion was assassinated.
So they immediately blamed the Christians.
And they immediately blamed Christians, even though it's probable that Christians were not involved. It was probably a Maoist group. There's a Maoist or left-wing insurgency going on in India. But Christians were immediately blamed. There was a virulent series of attacks
very brutal.
Very brutal attacks on Christian homes, Christian churches, and to this day there are tens of thousands of people who remain displaced, who remain afraid to go back to their homes. This is almost 10 years later. Now, it should be said, this is a highly unusual incident in terms of its scale, in terms of its ferocity. However, it's also true that you probably have dozens of low-level, non-lethal attacks on Christians every year, even to this day.
Were the perpetrators brought to justice?
No, the perpetrators have by and large not been brought to justice. There remains a
and
real
why
problem
is that,
here.
though?
Well, that's a very good question. It no doubt is partly because the Indian judiciary system in general is backlogged with cases. It's not a very efficient judicial system. Even ordinary cases can take many, many years to run through the judicial system. But it's also true that unfortunately in some parts of India, many people who have been responsible for attacks on religious minorities are just not brought to justice because of a sense that these religious minorities had it coming to them. Again, because of the fear or belief about predatory conversion. There was terrible violence against Muslims in Western India, in Gujarat in 2002, in which probably 1,000 Muslims and some Hindus were killed. Many of the people involved in that violence have never been brought to justice as well.
The crowd, maybe about 300 to 400 people, came in the morning. And from this spot itself, they started attacking the people, breaking the houses and burning the houses. And the violence continued all throughout the day.
Since about 1998, there's been a real rise in incidents of violence against Christians. The Kandhamal riots were really of a far more widespread and far more significant nature.
What did the Indian Christians do after those riots?
Well, they first of all tried to figure out how they could survive. Many Christians and other aid workers went to that part of India simply to provide relief. So the first thing they did is they set up camps, refugee camps, simply to take care of the victims. But among the first things after that is that Christians really began to reach out to their Hindu neighbors, began to try to rebuild a sense of civil society, a sense of harmony, a sense of understanding and trust. And this is one of the most important findings, by the way, of our entire Under Caesar's Sword project. We think of the victims of persecution as being tempted to lash out in kind of violence or in condemnation of the groups that were responsible. But in most of the cases that we study around the world, we don't see Christian communities doing that. We see them building bridges with the majority community, trying to understand what happened in order to ensure that there is not a repeat of this sort of violence. So we see people praying, people extending forgiveness, people just quietly rebuilding, not lashing out though in terms of revenge or certainly not violence.
But isn't it because Christians typically don't respond with violence that they're so easily preyed on?
Well, it's probably possible to make that argument, that Christians, because they've generally not responded with violence, have made themselves prey to further violence and exploitation. I think it's fair to say that Christians, though, I think are making the right judgment, that in many of these contexts, if they were to respond with violence, that the response from the majority community, from militant groups, would be to inflict even more ferocious violence. Christians, after all, are only 2-3% of the Indian population. In Egypt, a case that you know well, a country we study in the project, Christians are perhaps 10%, perhaps more, perhaps less, of the Egyptian population. There, too, Christians have faced horrific provocation right up to the present. And it's remarkable the extent to which Christians have been restrained, nonviolent. Pope Tawadros, the head of the Coptic Church, has repeatedly emphasized that we will not respond in kind to this violence. And I think in the long run, that is the right strategy. One, it's faithful to the teaching of the founder of Christianity, but it's also probably a smart strategy, that Christians are really trying to survive, often under difficult circumstances, and they understand that the way to do that is to build up their own institutions and also to try to build these bridges of understanding.
You know, there are small Christian militias in Syria.
Yes, that's right.
They've taken up arms to defend their homes.
That's right, yes.
What do you think of that? Does that work?
I think in cases where there is essentially no writ of state authority, in cases that are essentially anarchic, where there is no government that can be relied on, that may well be what Christians need to do. It's a case that's very different from a case like India or Egypt, where you have functioning civil authority which can be relied upon, at least to some extent, to bring at least a modicum of justice. But there you have really no effective state authority in large swaths of Syria and Iraq. And some Christians have formed militias. You could argue that some parts of northern Nigeria are similar, and there too Christians have formed militias, self-defense militias, to defend themselves. And certainly is an understandable and probably logical response.
We want to be careful not to judge communities who have made that difficult decision that maybe armed defense is the only way for them to survive. But we do note that in the global profile, armed violence is very rare.
I think many Christians realize that the only world in which they're going to be more secure is a world in which everyone is more secure.
What's the significance of the title of the film, Under Caesar's Sword?
Well, the purpose of the title is to sort of hark back to a period really from the founding of Christianity up until about the 4th century, when Christians were literally under the sword of Caesar, because Christians refused to worship Caesar in the way the Romans asked them to, namely as a kind of god. And so Christians lived under Caesar's sword. They wanted to create their own independent life and community, and they refused to divinize the state or political authority, and therefore they faced the sword of Caesar. We see the same dynamic today. There are many places around the world, North Korea is an extreme case, where the ruler views himself as a kind of god on earth. There are many governments which essentially will not tolerate any kind of independence or freedom. There are some governments that literally want to wrap themselves in the mantle of religious authority, and Christians will not accept that. Christians insist on being able to have the freedom to be faithful to what God is calling them to be, to have their own churches. And so, like in the early centuries of the church, many Christians today are living under Caesar's sword.
What are some of the coping strategies that Christians have developed?
Well, there are a number of them, and these strategies really span across a wide range. We call these survival strategies. One strategy is for Christians really to essentially keep their head down, not be demonstrative about their faith in public.
Stay under the radar.
Stay under the radar. Continue to build ministries and churches, but be careful about having a public profile. We see that all across the world. Another coping strategy is to try to build relationships with people who are outside the church, even with government officials where they can at the local level, members of other religious communities. In Sri Lanka, a Buddhist majority country, we were struck by the extent to which Christian communities who, especially in rural areas, face pretty serious occasional persecution, sometimes instigated by militant Buddhist monks. We see them trying to engage in interfaith efforts, interfaith dialogue, in order to dismantle and address misunderstandings that people have about who Christians are and what they believe.
You mentioned Africa. There's a gospel singer from Eritrea.
Yes.
She was arrested and held in a shipping container for over 2 years.
Yes.
What's happening in Eritrea?
Yes, this is really one of the most egregious cases of religious persecution in the world, and it's a country where Christians are the disproportionate victims. There are certain Christian groups, mostly Pentecostal, that are regarded as a threat to the state, and people are literally asked to recant their faith, and if they do not, they are placed in the desert in shipping containers with inadequate food and water, as Helen Berhane was for over 2 years. This goes on today.
This is by the government?
This is by the government. This is not an instance of a non-state actor like ISIL. This is the state really undertaking these efforts. Again, because...
And is that legal according to their constitution to do that to people?
It probably is inconsistent even with their own constitution, where there is at least nominal respect for religious freedom. And this, by the way, is in a country which has a large Christian population.
Right.
So this is not an instance of non-Christians attacking Christians. This is an instance of, in some cases, Christians who are part of the state apparatus as well as non-Christians regarding these independent evangelical and Pentecostal movements as a threat. These kinds of attacks, persecutions, imprisonments continue to go on.
Let's talk about Turkey, because before the start of World War I, Christians made up about 20% of Turkey's population. Now, less than 1%. What happened to all of them?
Yes, this is about 100 years ago, of course. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the so-called Armenian genocide.
So-called because Turkey doesn't want to call it that.
So-called because Turkey doesn't want it. I'm willing to call it that. I say so-called in part because we think of it as an Armenian genocide, and therefore we think of it as somehow ethnic. But really it was a Christian genocide. The targets of that genocidal program were Christians in general, not just Armenians, Greek Christians, Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians.
Assyrians.
Assyrians suffered massive violence, displacement, and this forced a huge outmigration of Christians from Turkey. And that has continued since that time. Even under what was supposedly the secular regime of Kemal Ataturk, there really has been an increasing fusion between Turkish national identity and Islam, such that anybody who's not a Muslim, even though this is a secular country, is really regarded as a threat.
So it's
to
getting
the state.
harder and harder to
So
be
it's
a
becoming,
Christian.
It is becoming harder and harder. There was a horrific instance in which 3 Turkish evangelical Christians were tortured and murdered a
By
few
who?
years ago. It's not clear. It may have been by nationalist elements in what's called the Turkish deep state, but it really isn't clear. And in Turkey, it's not just Islamists, therefore, that are targeting Christians. It's really Islamists and secular nationalists, again, who regard Christians as really, a fifth column, as not authentically Turkish.
A century ago, 1/3 of the Istanbul population was non-Muslim, which would mean Greeks first, Greek Orthodox, then Armenians, then Jews. Today it is less than 1%, very tiny communities. How did this happen? Well, Turkey got rid of its Christian minorities to a great extent, unfortunately, by population exchanges, by expelling them.
Tell me a little bit about the project Under Caesar's Sword. Did you also study how best Western countries can help persecuted Christians?
Yes, we did. So we have a strong focus on, as you said, responses to persecution and what responses can be effective, can actually help people who are suffering. And one of the things we found is that Western governments and groups and activists can be most helpful by really aggressively advocating for the religious freedom of everybody. There's a tendency on the part of some Christian activists to try to speak only about Christians. But in many, many cases, it isn't just the Christians who are suffering persecution. In India, for example, Christians are suffering, but Muslims are suffering too. In Pakistan, Christians are suffering, but Hindus are suffering there. And when activists speak only about Christians, they feed into this narrative that this is really about promoting the geopolitical interests of the West, which is associated with Christianity. Or this is really about undermining the traditional majority culture of this or that society. So we have to be very careful, and I think we've really concluded that Westerners who want to help Christians can do so by advancing the universal human right of religious freedom. For everybody.
There's different schools of thought as to how we can help.
Mm-hmm.
One is to say we have to be able to protect Christians where they are,
Yes.
to keep them there. The other school of thought says get them out, get them
Yes.
to the West where they'll be free and they'll be able to live happy lives. Where do you come down on that?
That's a very good question, a very hard question. I think one has to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Certainly the ideal is to enable Christians to live where they call home. Christians have deep roots in many of the societies that we're talking about. You mentioned the fact that Christianity goes back, may well go back to St. Thomas in 52 AD. He may have arrived in Western India. In Egypt, of course, the original Egyptian civilization, the Coptic civilization, really was developed by Christians before Islam arrived many centuries later. You can repeat that story over and over again about the countries that we're talking about. So it would be a tragedy if we sort of tried to help Christians in a way that actually accelerated their evacuation from these countries. Partly because it's not necessarily good for the Christians themselves, it's also not good for these societies that need the influence of Christians because they've enriched these cultures, they've contributed to a dynamic pluralism in many of these societies. These societies would be much the poorer. Now there are cases, extreme cases, clearly, where for Christians to survive, they need to get out. And clearly Iraq and Syria has been that kind of case.
You know, you study this subject. There's a lot of Christian persecution, as we said early on in this interview. Are you discouraged?
No, I'm not discouraged. This project has really cast a powerful spotlight for me, and I think for all of us, on the remarkably positive ways that Christians are responding to the horrible things happening to them. They are not responding in kind, but they really do have a hope. They really do have a faith in God, and they're responding in ways that are constructive, that bear witness to the love that they have learned from their Lord, and that are also building remarkable bridges of trust with, in some cases, the people who've inflicted the persecution upon them. And you can see some countries clearly improving. Sri Lanka is a case where a couple of years ago the situation looked very discouraging, but in part because of the hopeful and positive way Christians are responding, the situation is much better than one would have expected it would become even only a couple of years ago.
Tim, thanks so much for being on the program.
It's a wonderful pleasure to be with you, Mimi. Thank you.
This has been the Mimi Gerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.